And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thanks so much for joining us once again. We head again stateside, happens a lot with us. And it is wonderful to have Nathan Simington with us today. Nathan, thank you so much for giving us your time.
It's absolutely a pleasure. Glad to be talking.
Not all. And I've seen your name because you have a position in the FCC. And we'll get into all of that in terms of media, in terms of censorship. And we have our own issues in the UK here and in Europe in terms of censorship. So I want to get into all of that. But maybe, Nathan, I can ask you to introduce yourself to the US viewers, to the War and Posse you're watching. You will be a known entity. To the UK, maybe less so. So maybe just take a moment and introduce yourself before we get into your new role and what that means for media in the US.
Absolutely. My name's Nathan Simington. If you can't tell from my accent, you shortly will that I'm Canadian originally. I became a U.S. citizen in 2017. And in 2020, I joined the first Trump administration at an agency within the Commerce Department, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. My prior experience was as a lawyer in private practice, and then working in-house at a telecom company. And then prior to that, my academic training was in classical music. So, I've really covered the waterfront in that respect. So after joining NTIA, I found myself eventually nominated to work on the Federal Communications Commission. And even for Americans, the FCC can be a little bit of an obscure institution. So we have a maximum of 5 commissioners. It's what's called an independent regulatory agency. So it combines some adjudicatory functions and some quasi-legislative functions with rulemaking, and then some quasi-executive functions. Now, people always ask, what article of the Constitution are you under exactly? And that's been an open question for some time. The existence of independent regulatory commissions has been settled for about 90 years, but this administration has brought them more firmly within the control of the executive branch. So that's going to have some implications for some things that we can discuss later on, as well as for probably a reduced scope of powers, which I think is probably going to be overall to the social benefit. But in any case, the ambit of our statute is interstate and international communications by radio and wire. So that covers the more you think about it, the more it covers, really, because that could be cellular phone service, that could be broadcasting, but it could just as easily be satellites. We're about 1,600 people to administer this all. And again, whether that's a lot or a little is is a point of view. I guess I would say the Department of Agriculture has, or had, I haven't checked the latest Doge figures, but had, last I checked, around 100,000 employees. So the FCC is, a much smaller entity. Like I said, with very broad jurisdiction, I think we run fairly efficiently and leanly to cover the waterfront. So that's a little bit of who I am, what I do, and how this organization works.
Maybe less a little bit about what that is like. You were appointed by President Trump. I've talked to many different people stateside. Some have been given positions, some have not. Um, Let us know what that was like. I'm sure it's a closed box, so I'm not asking you to divulge information, but simply um, getting that call or getting that message and realizing that your name is going forward. So let us know about that.
Well, I was the backstory on this is that one of the prior Republican commissioners on the commission, there's a requirement legally that only a maximum of 3 members can come from the same party, so you can have a majority but not total numerical dominance. In any case, so one of the Republican commissioners was refused for renomination by President Trump in 2020. So that led to the question of who exactly is going to sit in that seat. The Senate wanted to make sure that someone was on the path to confirmation before the election took place. When I say confirmation, again, just for context, this is a Senate confirmed position, which means the president nominates you, but then you have to receive a majority of votes in the Senate or a winning vote in the Senate in order to actually be seated. Part of the constitutional compromise for how cabinet and other significant positions are staffed. So in any case, they needed to have someone on the road to Senate support regardless of how the election results came up, because there's a tradition that the chairman, who was at that time the Republican Ajit Pai, uh, resigns on inauguration day. And so at that point, the partisan balance of the commission was going to go 2-1 in favor of the Democrats if there had not been a Republican confirmed, or 2-2 with parity if there had been a Republican confirmed. So the Senate was sensing that, if President Trump were to lose the election and lose his seat, then they would still want to have as many people seated at the major agencies as possible, who would have durable seats throughout. So I wound up being seated in December 2020. I believe I took office on December 14th, 2020, making me one of the very, very last first Trump administration people to be seated. And then I served in this job for all 4 years of the Biden administration. And now I find myself back headed for majority, because although we're 2-2 right now, President Trump sent the nomination of a lady named Olivia Trusty for the third Republican seat to the Senate early in February, acting with alacrity. And so she will most likely be seated later this month. So that's as far as what the process is like. I don't think I was necessarily the first person to get a look in the first Trump administration, because I got the call. Would you be interested to coming into the White House early next week on a Saturday night when I was in the checkout line at Target, and not very clearly not expecting the call. I know they looked at least one other person from my agency before they called me. So I don't think I was on the short list, but eventually I wound up as the finalist somehow. I guess sort of like one of these Cinderella stories where a lower league team just keeps winning and just keeps getting promoted. I don't know. So I wound up being the candidate who was officially nominated, I guess, early in September. And at that point, there was a certain amount of path dependency because there wasn't time for anyone else. So it was either sink or swim. Either I was going to make it work, or else I was going to be too embarrassing to vote for, and then I wouldn't have gotten seated.
How is it, I guess, looking at where continuity, and you've experienced very different presidents, so it'd be interesting to get thoughts on that. But in terms of continuity, how does it normally work? You have the commissioners work in each of those areas, um, but yeah, how does that work in terms of, I guess, continuity? Because you bring a lot where often a new president comes in, there are big changes. President Trump is no exception to that. So, kind of, how do those commissioners provide the continuity to keep doing what you're legally supposed to do?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad that we can rely on the high quality of the professional staff at the Federal Communications Commission. That's a lot of people really have this very strong sense of public service, regardless of their partisan affiliation. And the professional staff is where you go to find, the person in the country who's the most expert on the economics of pole attachments, or the person who's the most expert on what the satellite TV regulations said in 1999. If it weren't for the staff, we couldn't get anything done, because they really are a repository of knowledge. And the great thing is that the staff are also quite politically disinterested. I mean, I know how they have their preferences, but at the end of the day, they tend to take direction rather well from the chair. It helps that the chair has the ability to appoint the heads of all of the offices and bureaus. So in addition to the direct presidential appointments, there are a number of subsidiary political appointments that establish firm political control. At the same time, the telecommunications bar would probably not tolerate seeing people seated who were purely political and didn't have a good understanding of the legal, regulatory, and other questions that they have to grapple with. So I think as an institution, we maintain continuity rather well. That said, obviously, some administrations have radically different policies in these areas. The first Trump administration focused a lot, I would say, on economic development issues. The Biden administration focused a great deal on, I guess, what you might call social welfare issues. And it looks as though the second Trump administration is going to address the question that I think has been out there for a long time, but has not really been answered. What does it look like when telecom regulation moves from being purely a question of economic regulation and into questions instead of telecom being everywhere? As a wise man once said, everything's computer. I would say everything's also telecom these days, that you can't talk about port operations without talking about the necessary telecommunications infrastructure. You can't talk about smart manufacturing without looking at the degree to which Chinese factories are increasingly running on 5G private networks, which is an application that was not foregrounded when we built out our own 5G networks in the United States and, for that matter, in Britain. Um, and or Canada for that matter. I think we've got to grapple with the degree to which telecommunications is no longer simply a matter of regulating an industry that's always going to be there and also always going to be substantially similar. Instead, we start having to ask questions about how telecommunications regulation can be synergistic with an overall national strategy. So, there's been some news about how the president has decreased the independence of the independent regulatory agencies. My view is that this is certainly with my own agency a necessary step towards breaking us out of our silos and getting us from being a little bit too navel gazing and instead getting us to interface more effectively with trade, national security, and other economic questions.
How does in the UK, and I'll keep making this just mention because I understand parts of the US media side, but many others I don't, and I've always been surprised at the amount of even when you're driving across so many radio stations, a lot of state stations and TV as well. We don't really have that here in the UK. It's much fewer outlets, where America seems to actually grow many different outlets and seems to have a freedom that we don't have here in the UK. But how is the role of the FCC in engaging with all of those? And is it different engaging with those who operate on a national level, like a large TV company? Is it different that to engaging with maybe a local radio station?
That's a great question too, because even for Americans, this can be very challenging to understand. But ultimately, the story of how we work in media is driven by the constraints of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is it's one of these things. Constitutional principles have a way of being taken very seriously in the United States and being vindicated at the Supreme Court. And our First Amendment protections are unusually absolutist in terms of speech. So let me unpack that. There's the United States has never had a media regulator per se. So, for example, it's always been impermissible for the federal government to regulate the content of newspapers. The test case on this, NYT v. Sullivan, is good precedent. It will probably be good precedent for a very long time to come. And so the predicate for any degree of broadcast media regulation in the United States has always been relatively slender. Specifically, the rationale for it is that when you broadcast on a given frequency at a given power level in a given geographic area, that's an exclusionary act because other people are thereby prevented from speaking on that frequency, etc. And therefore the government has a heightened interest in the contents of that speech relative to its mandated disinterest in the contents of merely published speech. Now, obviously, this doesn't go anywhere so far as editorial control. Nonetheless, this is the basis for the United States barring, for example, some kinds of obscene or patently offensive, excessively violent broadcasts, things of that nature. It's the basis for having political advertisement regulations on broadcast media. But, we couldn't put political advertisement regulations in a newspaper. We couldn't put them on a website. We can only put them on broadcasting, just as one class of examples for this, because broadcasting is inherently exclusionary. And the leading case on that is the Red Lion Supreme Court case of 1969, which, as the Supreme Court shows no sign of overturning. So, in short, only broadcasting is regulated in the United States. Now, you ask, what about a big TV company? The fact that broadcasting is regulated in this way in the United States has given rise to specific legal categories in the United States, effectively, where a broadcaster is distinct from a network, which is distinct from a cable station, and which is in turn distinct from a cable system that carries cable channels. So the relevant thing here is that the content of broadcasting is much more easily regulated than any of those others. And so if you are a TV network for that, for example, then there's absolutely nothing stopping you from going far, far outside of what would be permissible in terms of content arising from a regulated broadcaster. Uh, at that point, freedom of speech kicks in, and the First Amendment protections are very strong. Adding to the complexity, networks also own some TV stations. So then there's that sort of blurs the boundaries. Is this an activity of the network which is not regulated, or is it an activity of the TV station which is owned by the network and whose acts can possibly be imputed to the TV station depending on the degree of information that that TV station had about it? So the distinction between a broadcaster and any other kind of media company is fundamentally back to constitutional arrangements in the United States. And when you talk about the huge number of broadcasters that one stumbles across driving across the United States, I guess my short answer would be those are the most regulated players in our media environment. They need FCC licenses to operate. We talk about everything from for example, time between license application, station construction completion, time on the air. We make sure that they maintain a caliber of a technical caliber of coverage and of emergency alert responsiveness, things like that. And they need our licenses to function. And they're among the most law-abiding players in anywhere in the in the United States because they're very worried about accidentally uh, crossing some line and having that license called into question, which can be the kiss of death. But our commitment to private media ownership in the United States is also a distinctive, also ultimately coming out of the First Amendment. So there's always been this question of how do we deal with a primarily private media environment, and how is that distinct from, for example, what I grew up with in Canada with the CBC, or from what people would have experienced in Britain with the BBC and other state media. So.
It come from Canada, then you have an interesting perspective because your background in Canada, mine in the UK, we have outlets that generally put themselves forward as they bring you news or bring you entertainment, but less so opinion. Now that is beginning to change. Now you look at the US model, and a lot of it is opinion based. And we are trying to understand in the UK whether that should even be allowed or not, because in terms of news broadcasts, it should only be the news and everyone knows what is true and what is not. Now, that, of course, has collapsed a lot. But yeah, that difference in the US outlook, where it is often outlets, whether it's radio or TV, um, it's around a host, it's around an individual, it's around a style, and people buy into that individual because of their opinion. Very different from the UK, from Canada and elsewhere. Let us know how you see that difference from your actual community experience and now in the US.
Absolutely. Well, I frequently get emails from the general public asking questions like, why are people just allowed to go on TV and tell lies? And the great thing is, I don't know until 3 or 4 lines in whether it's coming from the left or the right. Because at the end of the day, forming consensus truth is very difficult. It's very difficult to agree, even sometimes on the basic facts of a situation or which facts are most relevant. And not to get overly postmodernist, but sometimes it's the selection of things that you choose to highlight or to pay the most attention to that wind up being as much the story as anything else. Sometimes the medium really is the message. Sometimes out of the hundreds of thousands of news stories that you could run any day, you pick 10, and you pick 10 because you have a particular point of view about what's relevant to the world. Now, I don't want to get, like I said, too postmodernist. I think we can all agree that local weather is significant. I think we can all agree that coverage of who's won an election is significant. And yet, at the same time, I think we've increasingly felt the boundaries fray somewhat between purely informative public broadcasting and opinionated public broadcasting. Perhaps as much as anything else, I don't want to speak for the UK. I'm not as familiar with or involved with the ecosystem there, but certainly in both Canada and the United States, to different degrees, there's a sense that media has been captured by a certain social class that advances its points of view, or that or that advances its polite opinion through the mechanism of state-supported media, or through the mechanism of simply controlling all of the avenues into becoming associated with broadcasting in the media industry. Journalism in the United States is frequently poorly paid, But if you have a private income, then perhaps that doesn't matter to you, and you can chase the prestige of journalism without having to worry about how you're going to pay your rent. We like to say that all men are created equal here in the United States, but that doesn't mean that all people have equal opportunities. And it's sort of interesting to hear this criticism coming from the right, because there's a certain point in time where it would have been standard fare on the left to say that the comfortable, fusty old jingos have always had control of the high points in culture, and we're here to break things up. Now it seems that there's almost a reverse of that polarity, where the academic and prestige forming organs of culture have been colonized by people with predominantly left-wing views and voting patterns. And if that's the case, then in the United States, at least, the inherently, I guess, private nature of media makes it possible for a different ecosystem to emerge. If I were, I guess, giving my amateur, unsolicited opinion to people living in the UK, it would simply be to gauge the degree of trust that you currently have in established channels of information. And to the degree that those seem uncongenial to you, then it's your duty to think for yourself and get information someplace else. And if what that winds up creating is an alternative opinion ecosystem in which people are willing to back their points of view up with facts and reason, and in which an alternative narrative emerges from those facts of reason, you have to facts and reason, I should say. Then you have to ask what was missing in the mainstream coverage of this. To what degree was it reflective of the class prerogatives, narrow parochial concerns, etc., of perhaps a group of people who are in the cultural high places, but whom you didn't vote for and you didn't particularly choose to be there. You might ask yourself, by what right are they in fact speaking for me, or presuming to tell me what I should think? Because at the end of the day, we've got individual responsibilities as free citizens to make our minds up on our own.
Is the role of the FCC to make sure, like a news channel is speaking truth? Is it to make sure offense isn't caused, or does it depend on? Because often now you see campaigns from both sides of the political aisle to actually have a certain broadcaster, maybe individual, chastised by the regulatory body, and you'll get campaigns and signatures and e-petitions, all of that. So how kind does the FCC fit into the middle of that? And I guess it's not making sure the business plan of an entity is followed. It's more those other areas, and you talked about the difference between, I guess, looking at economic, but also the focus on what is going out in terms of culture and truth.
Yeah, well, that's the difficulty, because we don't want to put ourselves in the position of presuming to adjudicate the truth. Very often, the truth only emerges in retrospect. There are very smart people working all the time with different points of view in all sorts of different areas, and I certainly don't believe that I have some sort of privileged knowledge or special expertise that will allow me to make final rulings in real time, such that I can deny news and opinion to members of the general public on that basis. I think that would be hubristic. It would be fundamentally anti-democratic, and the FCC would, should it ever set itself up as a ministry of truth, we would immediately have our hands slapped severely by the Supreme Court. So we've also been delivered from all temptation on that front. As far as the content of broadcasting, I don't think we would ever feel that we could presume to step in and exercise editorial control, or even exercise an editorial chilling effect. It's all right for broadcasters to be extremely opinionated, and we're not going to force them to be fair and to consider an alternative point of view, because again, at that point, we might start artificially privileging, for example, a distasteful minority point of view simply because it was the oppositional one, or we might simply be imposing on the freedom of thought and of expression, and of course of the associated editorial decisions that go along with that. So one might ask, why are we here at all? But there are some reasons. We can start to step in if there's a deliberate misrepresentation of a newsworthy event. There has not been a test case on this for about 30 years, so it's not something the FCC does very frequently. We used to do it more in the past when broadcasters hadn't yet learned good habits in this area. But when I say a misleading presentation of a newsworthy event, let me give some hypothetical to help flesh that out a little bit. If a candidate for senator, a major party candidate for senator, were to go on TV and say the sun rises in the west, there's not a darn thing we could do about it. That's obviously patently untrue. Everyone could agree it's untrue. But the mere fact that it was a major public figure making that statement would make it a newsworthy statement. And it's not necessary for the station broadcasting that content to endorse it or to attempt to convince the public that it's true to nonetheless carry it. In fact, if public figures are making ridiculous statements, that is absolutely news and presumably should be broadcast far and wide so people can make up their own minds about the credibility or lack thereof of such figures. On the other hand, if you were to splice some audio and video, or perhaps to use an AI transformation on a live interview, so that someone were to say, the sun rises in the west if you're looking at the world backwards, and then drop the last part of the sentence so that you appeared to make the person make a ridiculous statement, then that could obviously be actionable. There might be there might be an action for there might be some sort of action that was not predicated on the FCC's regulatory jurisdiction. There might be an action for blackening the person's reputation, but unfairly. But on the other hand, the FCC could also at that point step in and say this is broadcast news distortion. A broadcaster that connived at this has abused the public interest that it represents in being allowed exclusionary use of the airwaves. And therefore, there is a reason for the FCC to get involved. So there are some narrow cases where the content of speech matters less because of what the content is than because of the role it plays in informing the public. But I want to be very clear that we've got strict guardrails around this, and there's much less broadcast regulation here, and certainly in content regulation of broadcasting, than you would see in any other advanced democracy.
Tell me, you regulate obviously radio, television. You talked about kind of cable news as well, but also it's wider than that. It's over internet. And how does that work? Because we are seeing a huge step change in the UK of if you have media online on the internet, that now falls under the government regulatory body, and they then can punish, and huge concerns about the UK and Europe. Australia also pushing, probably Canada will now also be pushing that. They failed before, they'll push it again. Um, so how does it work in the US? I mean, how long has the internet been under the FCC's jurisdiction? Because again, the UK, it was a wild west, which kind of worked to an extent, but now it's looking like it'll be more tightly and tightly regulated.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because with the lack of a general communications regulator in the United States, that also means that there's a lack of an internet regulator. And indeed, we might ask, what is it about internet specific? How do we separate internet from other activities? For example, is Walmart an internet company simply because it does a large volume of online sales? And yet, most people would feel that naturally Amazon is an internet company and Walmart is not. So cutting this cleanly at the joints in a legally defensible way is not the easiest question. Now, a little history on the American side. So in 1995 or 96, I think 95, the federal government recognized that there was greater commercial involvement of the internet and that more and more people were getting internet connections at home. Now, back in 1995, there wasn't a lot of web to browse. Tim Berners-Lee had only invented HTML and the first websites about 3 years prior. But nonetheless, as a killer technology, it had a certain degree of early adoption, and many people were excited to have their first email account and other things. So the legislative branch, noticing that it was a wild west, tried to step in and to regulate internet communications on a similar basis to broadcast media with the so-called Communications Decency Act. The Communications Decency Act did not survive a constitutional challenge, and in the landmark Rena v. ACLU case of, I believe, 99, the Communications Decency Act was struck down in its entirety, with the exception of the famous Section 230, which is now part of the Communications Act, which is my governing statute at the FCC. Section 230 is a grant of freedoms to websites, freedoms from liability for the material that they carry, assuming that it was not editorially generated by that website. And the basis for that is even pre-internet electronic bulletin board litigation. We didn't want people who were posting on these early electronic bulletin boards, or rather, we didn't want the companies running those electronic bulletin boards to shut them down and chill speech, either because they would suffer liability for leaving something up, or because they would suffer liability for taking something down. So we tried to codify those two protections to make sure there would be more speech online rather than less, and that's really what Section 230 is looking to do. It's only 26 words, but those 26 words have been very influential in the world and have influenced national law in other countries and state law in the United States. I would say, however, that beyond the words of the statute, early interpretations from the federal courts in the United States have ensured that the Section 230 protections are very broad, and that's why it's very difficult to go after a website for content that appears on that website unless the content is illegal for another reason. If so, for example, if there is, in particular, the FOSTA-SESTA pair of laws, FOSTA is the House version, SESTA is the Senate version, from 2018, related to online trafficking, and that's why Craigslist famously shut down its personal section, because they were afraid that there was a chance that people would be trafficked through there, and they didn't want to provide a venue for that unless potentially incur liability. But even so, it's still possible for a site to carry illegal content without that site itself um, being liable for that content, which I think is a distinction that chills the blood in many other advanced countries and makes them ask: is this in fact the Wild West in the United States? And in fact, I've had people in the UK make the very interesting point that sometimes they're trying to get takedowns of, for example, illegal pharmacies that are shipping pills across national borders, or that they are trying to prevent harassment that would be illegal under UK national law from taking place on websites that UK law is unable to reach or unable to identify the owner of, and that the 230 protections thus really do impede the social functions that many British people have come to expect will be civilly or criminally protected. So at this point, the Wild West in the United States might be causing problems for some of our friends and allies. As against that, Section 230 is so broad, and the court decisions interpreting it are so broad that Congress would really have to step in and fundamentally change the way it works for the situation to deviate significantly from where we are now.
Let me pick one or two things that you've said, and then kind of maybe what you mean, and it fits into currently where we are. I think it was a headline a few days ago saying FCC Simington blasts broadcast networks as a corrupt media cartel, and talking about punishing different outlets financially. I mean, maybe expand on that a little bit. What do you mean? It's a very Trump statement, corrupt media cartel. And I could say the same here for the UK, that we have that very much in evidence. But no, maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's strong language for a mild-mannered Canadian, isn't it? But there's a serious point here. So I'm not coming in and merely complaining that I don't like the tone of network coverage and therefore it should change to please me. I hope I've established that there's no adequate basis for this. Obviously, there is a lot of popular anger around network coverage, but I think the important thing to surface is actually the economics of network coverage in the United States. Now, you'll have to forgive me for going a little bit into the weeds, because Trumpy language aside, there's a rather technical point that I'm trying to support here. Now, with the private broadcasting that you've noted is so pervasive across the United States, that means that cable systems had to confront the question: are they going to carry local TV or are they not? This was solved by the provision of a mandatory license for which there must be mandatory compensation from TV channels to the local cable systems. So the fees that cable systems pay to local TV for this coverage are called retransmission fees. So there are also fees that get paid from local broadcasters to the major broadcast networks for the privilege of affiliating with them and receiving their content. And those are called affiliation fees, but in casual language, they're often called reverse retransmission fees. They're not creatures of statute the way retransmission fees are, but nonetheless, they're seen as sort of a balance. The cable pays the broadcaster, and the broadcaster pays the network. You notice who's at the end of that payment terminus. Well, the thing is, with broadcasters relatively financially weak, and yet at this point the primary engines of local journalism, with most newspapers dead or on the ropes in the United States, um, networks have found, I don't want to say all networks, but some networks have taken to extracting retransmission fee concessions that are much higher than the historical norm. I saw a piece in Bloomberg that says that the portion of retransmission that gets paid up to the networks is averaging between 45 and 55% right now. But I know of cases where there are major broadcasting groups, maybe upwards of 100 stations, that are paying 90% and that have contracts proposed to them that will pay more than 100% in the future. So with economics like that, I think most Americans do not realize the degree to which the necessity for paying for network TV is going to impact the ability of their local stations to deliver the news, weather, and local sports coverage that are the primary basis for their interest in those stations. Most people will simply stop watching TV, even more than they already have, if the stations get turned into rerun-laden cash cows with very little original content. At that point, it's an inferior version of a website, and you'll probably just switch to an online service. But on the other hand, if original content is being generated at a local level, well, this has created economic difficulties all throughout the world because in Canada just as much, in Australia just as much. For example, local broadcasters have found themselves struggling with the question, what do I do when my clips are shared on social media? What do I do when I'm the one generating important content for the public and yet my economics are poor? And the players who do not generate content are nonetheless in a better position to monetize their content than I am. Now, different solutions have emerged in different countries, but that's the economic crux is the same in all situations. So at the end of the day, what I'm asking for is for the federal government to take a serious look at where reverse retransmission or affiliation fees have gone, and to ask the question, does it truly serve the public interest for the people doing local journalism and local reporting to see so much of their revenues stripped away to pay for network programming? And are they facing an intolerable choice on either end where they disaffiliate and lose their ability to carry that network programming, with the network perhaps standing up an alternate station to compete with them on the one hand, or do they maintain the affiliation, eat the financial loss, and cut back their newsrooms? I don't think most Americans realize this choice is really upon us, but increasingly it will be. So it's my intent to surface that and get people asking the question of what they want their media landscape to look like, and do they want the federal government to take a role?
And part of the question, what the media landscape looks like, probably fits in, and you've talked about this in the last few days as well, about President Trump's $20 billion lawsuit against CBS. Those are numbers which are well outside my thinking as a non-American. But I mean, let us know how that works with the president going up against CBS, and kind of how that fits. That number is a big number. That must shock the system to some extent. But how is that played out, and what will that mean? Will that mean I guess a court decision on whether or not a media company has broken certain impartiality rules?
Well, it certainly could. Of course, not all lawsuits are seen through to the final bang of the gavel. The American legal system encourages settlement at every stage of the process. It's as a way of preserving public resources and as a way of closing issues with less expenditure of time as well. So it could well be that the parties will reach a settlement. I believe there's been some talks about whether that will take place, about whether the president will involve himself in those negotiations. I guess the interesting thing with CBS in particular, CBS, the complaint there is about, in fact, broadcast news distortion, that rather recently little used provision which is still on the books at the FCC. And when I saw the complaint about broadcast news distortion cross my desk, I suppose that would have been in December sometime. I remember reading it through with a great deal of skepticism because like I said, I get many emails all the time from members of the general public complaining that coverage is distorted, and usually it's not within the meaning of how we think about news distortion. They're complaining about the content, not about misleading presentation at an editorial level of a newsworthy event. So when I received the complaint, I thought, well, this is probably the most well pleaded complaint that's crossed a commissioner's desk in some time. Then I thought, well, this is the lawyer in me thought it's time for a test case on that. Obviously, it'd be mischievous for me to take a position along those lines, but I couldn't help but think, the question of presentation is usually not well addressed in in these, but it's really the crux of the president's lawsuit in some ways that that they're asking the question: was a broadcaster that was directly involved with the editorial process and under common control with the network, therefore potentially liable if the network had done something that would have been permissible for a network but not for a broadcaster? See, there's that First Amendment thing coming in again. It doesn't always play out the way that you would think. It's unquestionably true that if there were that if this had been, for example, a pure web production, then the only legal remedies available would be something along the lines of defamation, and that's not really what we're talking about here. But the nexus with broadcasting is interesting because at that point it does bring out a public interest dimension that wasn't applicable elsewhere. And on the $20 billion, I agree with you. That's an astronomical sum. I was trying to think of some way uh, to make it more palpable. How about this one? The distance between Earth and the Sun is about 98 million miles. So in other words, let's round that up and make it an even 100 million. So in other words, that would be $20 for every mile between the Earth and the Sun. You could be a long time picking up all those bills.
Wow. Can I also ask you about, again, something which, going through hotel rooms in the US, and you end up sitting watching cable news sometimes, and you kind of have content and then an advert. Actually, you have a lot of adverts with some content in the middle. I think that's how I would perceive it. But again, a lot of those adverts um, are pharmaceutical industry. Um, and obviously and I always love those adverts because the part of the advert that talks about side effects can be longer than the actual advert itself, and you'll probably understand that not coming from the US either.
Yeah.
But how does that work in terms of funding? Because the media companies rely on that advertising, and there's a lot of discussion of with RFK especially of how that industry could be changed. And I'm wondering whether or not that will mean less money. So, yeah, the whole area of advertising is a fascinating, and the American model is probably quite different from many other countries.
Well, you've said a mouthful there. That's a great point because on the one hand, it could mean less money in broadcast advertising and in cable and network advertising, and on the other hand, it could indicate that these advertising spots are desirable so much so that the drug industry, which has to recoup great quantities of money in order to pay for upfront development costs, the upfront development cost for a drug might be $1 billion. So then, you don't just need to make your billion back, but you need to make back the carrying charges of all that money and recruitment and effort over perhaps 10 or 20 years of the pharmaceutical trials, etc. So the very fact that something as high value as that is being selected for these advertising slots indicates to me that they're advertising slots that will continue to be desirable if there winds up being a change in the rules. On the specific question of the economics of this and how it affects different players, well, again, that's interesting because you'll note I distinguish between broadcast, cable, and network advertising. And so if you're watching in a hotel room, then you are going to be watching most likely on the hotel room's cable subscription, which means that they will carry a mix of broadcast channels, of pure network provided content, and of specialty channels, which are also probably associated with a network such as Disney. And so the splits for advertising among those different parties are going to be established by a thicket of bilateral contracts as between broadcaster and cable and network and broadcaster. And the economics of those could be fascinating and can vary immensely on the basis of what type of programming it is. So if it's network originated programming that goes to a cable system, then changing the economics of that won't directly affect broadcasters in any way. On the other hand, if it's professional sports, then there's almost certainly a broadcaster at the source of it that's doing the original sports reporting, and then that content is being licensed to someone else, and most likely the broadcaster gets a little bit of the advertising at the beginning, a little bit at the end, and the rest of the advertising goes to other players. And then, of course, if you are talking about purely online content, which is increasingly a part of the media diets, especially with sports rights increasingly being a focus of bidding for online companies, then you're turning it all topsy turvy again, because the networks negotiate directly with the online companies, and they do that on behalf of the broadcasters. Now, some people might call that a conflict of interest, but that's established business practice. So, as soon as you start looking under the skin in the advertising world, it gets very complicated. The social media companies are also involved because they provide much of the necessary geo-targeting and population partitioning information. So even if you're not watching it online, online is still watching you. In order to figure out how to advertise to you. So it's there. That's why there's a whole ad industry out there. It's very complex.
Nathan Simington, great to have you giving us an overview, I think, of the Federal Communications Commission. And I certainly wasn't aware so much of the inner workings. So thank you so much for your time today and helping shine a spotlight on how the Commission works. Really helpful. So thank you for your time.
It's been an absolute delight. I have to say, I appreciate your interest in drilling down to this level of technical detail. This is exactly why people like new media, because if they really want to learn something, then often new media is the right place to go. It's been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much.